Welcome to the sixth part of SpringBoot Tips series. In this video, we are going to learn about exception handling in SpringBoot applications. Exceptions might occur for various reasons. Maybe a user provided invalid input, or you might be talking to a third-party service which thrown some exception, or you might have some bug in your code. So for whatever reason, when exception happens, you need to handle it gracefully and then give appropriate response to the consumer. So in this video, we are going to learn about how we can implement exception handling and what are all the features Spring Boot is already providing out of the box. The way we handle exception depends on the application type. If it is a traditional web application, when some exception occurred, we might want to display an error page with appropriate user-friendly error message. Whereas in REST APIs, if any exception occurred, we might want to return JSON or XML based response along with appropriate HTTP status code. So let us generate a Spring Boot application and learn how to handle exceptions. So here I am generating a new Spring Boot application and I have selected these status. I have selected Lombok, Spring Web, Spring Data JPA, S2 database, validation and Thymeleaf. So I am generating the application and I am going to open it in my IntelliJ IDEA. I have opened the application in my IntelliJ IDEA and also I have created a new home controller. This is a plain normal controller, not REST controller. And here we have a get mapping endpoint. So here we are adding a attribute called greeting and add it to the model. And we are returning the view name as index. So this is going to render a Thymeleaf template inside src main resources templates. We have this index.html, which is nothing but a Thymeleaf view. And here we are printing the greeting attribute that we added in our controller. So let us run this application and see. So the server is started, and if I access localhost 8080, I'm able to see the message working fine. So now let us go back to our code and add a request parameter. Add request param, and which is optional string code, and within the method body I'm going to add this check of if code is equals to 400, I'm going to throw an exception. Okay, so now if I restart the server and if I rerun the application and access it without any code, it's going to render the same message without any issue. But if I add this code equals to 400, I'm seeing this white label error page. So we have not created any such page. It is automatically generated by Spring Boot. So let us explore a little bit more in detail how Spring Boot is providing this feature by default. Let us understand how Spring Boot is able to automatically handle the unhandled exception and show this default error page. If we look up this error MVC auto configuration, one of the auto configuration provided by Spring Boot, it is responsible for auto configuring all this, how unhandled exceptions has to be handled and all that. So if you scroll down, there is this white label error view configuration, which is enabled by default. This is going to render that default view page. So here we see this default error page is constructed within the code itself and then finally rendered it. So here we can see there are a few attributes that we can display on the error page. Okay. So now if we go back, we can see this timestamp and we can see what type of error we encountered and what is the status code. So we can even turn off that white label error page. Let us see what happens if we turn off it. If we turn off it, we can see this white label error page. So if we turn off it, we can see this white label error page. So if we turn off it, we can see what happens if we turn off it. So we can even turn off that white label error page. Let us see what happens if we turn off it. Okay, by default it is enabled. Let us disable this, and if we restart and rerun. So now Spring Boot is no more handling that and then leaving it up to the web server. So by default we are using Tomcat. So this exception is handled by Tomcat by rendering this default error page, Tomcat's error page. Okay, and also let us revert this. And, we can remove that property so that Spring Boot is going to handle this. Also, it provides some of the customization options for rendering what properties we want to render. Here, if we render, uh, we are seeing this timestamp and exception type and status code, right? We can we can configure some properties like include message always. So right now we throw this exception with this message bad code, but it is not being rendered here so far. We add this include message equals to always, and if we restart we can see the message as well. So here we can see bad code, and also uh, we can include server error, include stack trace as well. So here we see this message along with entire stack trace as well. So during development, maybe we can conditionally enable that property, and then we will be able to see entire stack trace as well. So like that, you can tweak the default configuration according to your needs. So Spring Boot is able to handle it by default, and then it is able to render this default error page. But what if we want to customize it? What if we want to show a nice error page, unlike this plain simple error page? So we can create our own custom error template, and we are able to render however the way we want to. Let us create this error.html inside this templates directory, and let me simply copy it, and here I'm going to update. So I'm just putting some error message, generic error message here. So if I restart and then access the same page, now by default it is going to render this error page. Okay. So that typically we want to render even the error page that suits styling and all with the rest of the web application. So we can put whatever the styling we want and then render this custom error page. And also Spring Boot provides some more convenience ways of displaying different error pages depending on the what type of error you are getting. So right now we are simply throwing this runtime exception, which means it is throwing this server error, HTTP status code 500. But what if I want to show a different error page depending on the type of error? Let us create a couple of error classes quickly. Bad request exception extends runtime exception. Okay. And also we can annotate with response status, and here we can say bad request. So what happens is if we throw this bad request exception, the response status code would be 400 bad request. And similarly, let us create another one called access denied exception. Okay, and it would be forbidden. Status code would be forbidden. Okay, so here when it is 400, let us throw this bad request exception instead of runtime exception. And here let us add some constructor. Okay, and if it is 403, I would like to throw access denied exception. You are not authorized to access this page. Okay, so if the code is 400, we are throwing this bad request exception. If it is 403, we are throwing this access denied exception. So when it is 400 and bad request exception happened, it is going to throw with 400 HTTP status code 400. Again, if it is throwing access denied exception, it is going to throw with 403 status code. So by default, we have this generic error.html page which renders if there is any unhandled exception happen. But what if I want to display a specific page when it is a bad request exception? What I can do inside this templates directory, I can create under error directory, I can create 400.html. So the 400 is nothing but the HTTP status code, and it should be under error directory. So let me just copy it and put it here and bad request error. So similarly, let me copy this and make it 403. Here we can say access denied. Okay. Okay. Now with this setup, let us just to recap within our controller, we are checking the input code and then throwing this exception accordingly. Let us go back, and here now, when I include code as 400, I am automatically getting this bad request error encountered, which is nothing but this 400.html. I don't have to write any code to do it like this because our error auto configuration takes care of this. And again, if you go back to this 403, it is going to display this access denied exception. Okay, uh, here, cool. Uh, so just like this, you can use specific error code .html, and then you can display whatever the message you want to display. And what if I want to display some more details, like what is the exact exception occurred and how I want to, maybe I want to display exception stack trace. How can I do that? So let us say right now we are using this access denied, right? So what we can do, um, we want to display message, error message, right? Here, th colon text. I am using this Thymeleaf text uh, tag to render a property of message. It should be text. Okay. Now, if I restart, I am saying you are not authorized to access this page, which is nothing but this exception message that I put in here. And what additional pieces we can access? One is timestamp. Okay. Another one is stack trace. Okay. So you can see we can display the stack trace when this exception occurred, and we can enter this message, and we can also get entire stack trace as well. So like that, whatever the properties that we have seen here, like timestamp, message, trace, status, so all this information, error, so all this information you can render in your custom templates as well. So here let us put few more. So This would be status. There is another error. Okay. So you can see status is 403 and error is forbidden. So like that, you have the access to all these properties. So if for any reason, if this customization is not sufficient for you, what you can do, you can create your own error handling controller. Let's say we call it as generic error handler. Okay. And we need to implement error controller from Spring Boot, and we need to mark it as a controller and also map it to the request mapping of slash error. And inside this you can have public void handle http servlet request, http servlet response, and here you can make it to request mapping. So why we need to implement this error controller? If you go back to this error MVC auto configuration, here it is registering automatically if there is no bean of type error controller is registered. So right now we are implementing our own controller by implementing this one. So it won't register this basic error controller, and we can handle exception in our own way. It won't be handled by basic error controller anymore. Okay. So yeah, that's how you can handle in a generic fashion in customized way. So far, we have seen how to handle this in a typical server rendered applications like using Thymeleaf templates. Okay, and this is not specific to Thymeleaf only. This is the same pattern that you can follow with other type of server-side templating engines as well. So now let us go back and see how we can handle errors in REST APIs. Okay. Okay, let us see how we can handle exceptions in Spring Boot REST APIs. So for that, I have created a JPA entity customer, and I have a primary key ID and a name and email properties. And I have also added Java bean validation API annotations like not empty and email for doing the field validations. And also I have Spring Data JPA repository, and then I have customer service, which is having a couple of methods like we have get all customers, and we have create customer, and then we have get customer by ID. Here we are looking up customer by ID. If there is no customer found, it is going to throw customer not found exception. So the customer not found exception is a simple runtime exception. We are simply saying with this message. And then we have customer controller with few API endpoints. One is to fetch all the customer, and another one is to fetch only one customer by ID, and then to create a new customer. And here we are using this at response status annotation to give 201 status code instead of default 200 when we successfully created a new customer. And also here we add at request body annotation to bind the input JSON payload into this customer object. And also we have this at valid annotation to trigger this validation on this customer object. So here we have this not empty, and email. So these validations will get triggered using this at valid annotation. Okay. So now in addition to these, I have added in a command line runner instance to initialize couple of customers into the database. And then we have this generic error handler. I think we don't need this. One more thing is we have these properties in our application.properties. First, let us comment this out and then see the default behavior of our application. Okay. Now I'm going to restart, and I'm going to invoke these customer controller API endpoints. Okay, so here we have this first get API slash customers, which is fetching both the customer details, and then we have this API slash customer slash one. We are trying to fetch the customer by ID one. We are able to get it. But if we try to fetch any customer details whose ID is not a valid one, so here we are getting this default error message with the status code as 500, and then this default response payload, error payload, that is already provided by same SpringBoot auto configuration. Okay. If you also notice here, we are seeing this path, error, status, and timestamp fields. And just like the way we customized for Thymeleaf error handling, if we add these properties, include message and include stack trace, let us restart and then see, we are going to get the same additional fields as part of this response as well. So the same settings works for both server-side rendering and then for REST APIs as well. So now if I trigger the same API endpoint, I'm seeing not only timestamp, status, error, and this entire stack trace are also included, and also the message customer ID not found. Okay, but this is not the way we want to give the error response to the consumers. First, one thing is here we are including all low-level details of our application, which is not good because they can look at this tag and then they can try out exploiting our application. And maybe this is not the format we agree upon to give response when something goes wrong. So how do we customize it? Well, let us look at that. So here, when we throw exception from get customer by ID, here when we give invalid customer ID, we are throwing this customer not found exception. So by default, we don't have any annotation over here. That's why when you see, it is giving internal server error 500. So if all we need to change is status code, we can simply use same technique response status. This should be not found. Okay, so with this annotation, we can change the response status code and still have this stack trace. Okay, and let us try it out. So this time we got the same response payload, but the status code is 404. If all we need to change is status code, we can simply done with it using this simple annotation here. But most likely we want to change the response payload as well. So in that case, how do we do that? There are several techniques to do it. Let us start with a simple try-catch approach. Okay, here we are calling customer service dot get customer by ID, and if you are getting a customer successfully, we are returning it. Otherwise, if it is throwing exception, it is handled by the Spring Boot. So let us start using simple try-catch approach. So we have try, and then we have customer not found exception, and here when this exception occurred, what we want to do, we want to return not found, and we want to return some payload, but that payload, let us create a object for representing that error response. Okay, so here it could contain message private string, okay, local date time timestamp. Okay, let us start simply. Here we have no ars constructor, all ars constructor, and getters. Okay, we want to return error response when customer not found exception occurred. Okay, what we can do, new error response, and the message, we can get the message from exception. And when this happened, now, okay, we got this error response and we want to return this as body when this exception happened. But the tricky part is we have this return type as response entity of customer. So we can't return any other object as the body. We should return only customer type. So one quick fix we can do is we can make it a generic argument with question mark so that you can return anything. It need not be customer, it need not be error response. You can return whatever type you want, you can return. So that is not a, in my opinion, it's not a good approach, because when I look at this signature, I can't be sure what is the return type. Okay, I don't know what is going to be written unless I read the entire implementation. I cannot be certain that what is going to be written from this method. Okay, so another way to handle it is using exception handler. So, so just like the way we have these request handlers, okay, we can have handler methods when some certain type of exception happens. So let us write a handler method, public response entity of error response handle, and what is the type we want to handle? Customer not found, and we are going to take that as a argument to that method. And here, instead of at get mapping, post mapping, things like that, we are going to use exception handler. What does this do? From any of our this controller handler methods, if customer not found exception is thrown, that is going to be handled by this method and then return response entity of error response type. Okay, so let us move this into here. Okay, and let us remove this entire try catch block and also move it back to return response entity of custom. Okay, now, so how the flow looks like now? When we make a call to this API, if it is successfully fetch a customer with the given ID, it is going to return with the status code 200 and with the response of customer entity. If customer not found exception is thrown, automatically Spring is going to call this handler exception handler method, and it is going to prepare this error response and then return this with the status code of 404 not found. Okay, so here, if you don't specify anything, it is going to be handled for whatever the exception type you defined here. But you can also explicitly define exception handler of so and so type. So it is going to be handling only this type of exceptions. So you can even mention multiple such classes. If you want to handle multiple types in the same way, we can even define a comma and whatever exception type you want to handle in the same way, you can define it here. Okay, let us run and see whether it is going to work or not. Okay, now if I make a call to customer ID 1, I am getting the success response with the proper payload. If I make an invalid customer request, I'm getting this message with so and so message and then with the timestamp. Now I'm getting the response. Okay, so this is how we can handle generically within the controller. That means this handler is going to be called only when any of these methods, these three API handler methods, throw customer not found exception. Okay, if there is another controller which is going to throw customer not found exception, this is not going to be handling. Okay, so this is per controller handler method. Okay, okay, but it looks like this exception can be thrown from multiple controllers. Assume we have multiple controllers, and from a different controller also we may get into this situation of where we throw this customer not found exception. So what do we do then? One bad approach would be to copy paste the same thing into multiple controllers to handle the same scenario, right? But there is a better way. Instead of copy pasting these things into each and all the controllers wherever you want to handle customer not found exception, you can have a global exception handler, and then you can use the same exception handler there, but you need to use this concept of controller advice. Okay, let us see. But before that, let us create another controller here. Let us create order controller, and it is a REST controller, and request mapping would be /API/orders. Let's say we have a method to fetch all the orders of a particular customer. Public list of, ideally it could be a list of orders, but just return a list of strings. Get customer orders. Okay, so here it would be get mapping of, and here I am expecting it could get customer ID as a request parameter. String long customer ID. Okay, and here just throw the exception, no logic. Customer not found exception, customer ID. Okay, so let us restart the service and try to call this API. Okay, API /orders, and we are going to call http localhost :800/API/orders question mark customer ID equals to 12. Anything. Okay. So what happened? This method simply thrown this customer not found exception, and because we have this annotation over here, it is going to return with status code 404, but it is throwing a default response body. It is not behaving in the same way when we call this customer get customer by ID API endpoint, because this exception handler is only for the handler methods defined within this customer controller only. When we make a call to another controller, and if it is the same exception thrown, but it is not handled the way it is handled here, right? It is giving a default response. So in such scenarios where we have same exception being thrown from different controllers, and we want to handle it in the same way, then comes into this controller advice we can use. So let us create a class called global exception handler. Right now we need to add this annotation controller advice. Okay, but we can use REST controller advice if we are building only REST API without any server-side template rendering. So let us use REST controller advice, and here I'm going to move this method exception handler method into this one. Okay, and here I don't have any handler for it. I just moved this method from this method to here global exception handler. Right now let us restart this. Okay, now let us call the same orders endpoint. Now it is going to be handled by the same exception handler method, and again fire this customers endpoint. So this is also going to be handled by the same global exception handler only. So The point is, if you have a same exception handler and you want to handle it in the same way, instead of duplicating the same code across controllers, you can use this controller advice, and you can have all these exception handler methods in one place. So it, in a way, it is a central place where we can put all this global unhandled exception handling logic. So anywhere in your controllers you are not handling any specific exception, you can handle it here. Okay. Also, a common practice is to have these specific exception handlers and also one generic exception handler, so that if you don't have any handler method for some unknown exception type, instead of throwing this exception, we can handle it using exception class. So we'll have handle exception, and this will be exception here, and usually that will be internal server error. Okay, so this way, if in your code there is some bug and then a null pointer exception occurred, instead of letting Spring handle it in one way, you can handle it this way generically. So if none of other exception handler methods are capable of handling that type, it is going to be handled by exception. Okay. Uh, and one more thing to note is we have used this REST controller advice annotation. It is nothing but a meta annotation which has controller advice and response body. Just like the way we have controller and at REST controller, it is the same thing. Like if you are building only REST API, you can use this REST controller advice. But if you are having some this Thymeleaf template, server side rendering, and all that, you can have exception handler controller or something like that, and you can use at controller advice, and from your method, let us copy it. So instead of returning response entity, we might be returning a string which represents a view name. Okay, so instead of this one, you could return some error page. Okay, like this. So what happens in the same way, if this exception occurred, you will build whatever response you want to add to the model and then return one view name using controller advice. So based on the application type, you can use either controller advice or REST controller advice. Okay, let us delete this. We don't need this controller advice. Okay. Now, let us restart the server, and then we have another endpoint called in our customer controller. We have this create customer API. Okay, let us call that once. We have this customer, and if we run this, because siva@gmail.com is already in the database and it is a unique field, it throws an exception. And because we have this in our global exception handler, we have this exception handler. So any exception that is thrown is handled by this method. So for time being, let us comment this out. Okay, restart. Okay, and re-trigger this API. So right now it is not being handled by our global exception handler because we don't have any specific handler for what is the exception it thrown, data integrity violation exception, right? And similarly, because these are supposed to be mandatory fields, right? Remember, we have on customer, we are binding it to customer object, and we have this at valid, and we marked uh, this name and email as non-empty, not empty, right? So what if I send name as empty? So it throws method argument not valid exception. Okay, it is from Spring. And also let us say we use a put method instead of post. And what happened? HTTP request method not supported exception. So there are a bunch of such exception types happen when you bind this request to handler method. Maybe we are using the wrong HTTP method, or the payload is not able to bind to the object due to validation failures. So there are a whole bunch of such exception types. So how do we handle it? One approach would be, again, go back to this and then copy paste the same thing. And what is the exception type? This is the one, and put it here, and change this name. And maybe it's not found. Probably it could be a bad request, or whatever the response status code you want to, you can change it and you can handle it. But there are a lot of such exception types happen. So Spring Boot provides a base class to handle all these exceptions as a convenience. So we don't need to define it like this. What we can do instead, we can simply extend response entity exception handler. So there is this convenience class which has this exception handling. So let us take a quick look at what is there in this. So it's an abstract class, and here we have a exception handler one method which is handling all these type of exceptions. There are a whole bunch of exceptions. Request method not supported, and we have this conversion not supported, type mismatch, and all type of exceptions, right? So what it does, it checks what is the exception type and then delegate to a dedicated method to handle that one. So most of these methods are already handled. Now, because we simply extended this response entity exception handler, we don't need to define our own exception handler to handle HTTP request method not supported exception. Let us restart and verify this time what response we are going to get. Hmm. So here, by default, it's simply written 405, okay, without any body. If that is all we want, that is fine. But let us change it to post and then post it. So again, this is a bad request because we have not given the mandatory input. It is simply giving the response status code, no body, right? But just returning HTTP status code might not be sufficient, and we might want to include some response body as well. So how we can override that behavior? So we can go to this response entity exception handler and say we want to handle this exception, right? HTTP request method not found. So here, this is the method that is handling. Just copy it and paste it over here. But maybe here you don't want to do all these things, but you want to prepare this error response, and then instead of null, you could include error response body, and maybe you want to make it public. Okay, so you can simply override that method from the parent and change the body to include this response, error response, whatever you want to return instead of null. Okay, let us restart. And here, if we go to API customers post, and we are not including, let us use a different put request here. So request method put not supported. This message. So we got the message, and then we included this, and then include the error response message and timestamp in addition to this one status code. So we have seen how to use this controller advice and centralize all exception handling logic in one place. But what if, let's say, In most of the controllers, wherever we encounter this customer not found exception, this is how we want to handle it. But in a specific controller, we want to handle it in a different way. How do we do that? So what we can do, we can take this customer not found exception. Let us say this is how we want to handle if this exception is being thrown from customer controller. But here in our order controller, if this exception is thrown, we want to handle it in a different way. So what we can do, we can have this exception handler for customer not found exception here, and then let us say instead of passing the message from the exception, we want to show no orders found for given customer ID. So this is the message we want to show, just simulating how you want to handle it in a different way. Okay, so anywhere if customer not found exception occurred, this is how it is going to be handled, except when order controller handlers throw this exception, this is how it needs to be handled. So let us verify this. Okay, if I go to here and I am trying to access customer with ID 11, which does not exist. So this is the error message I am getting, customer with ID not found. So that is nothing but the way we are handling in global exception handler, this way. But if we go to this orders customer ID equals to 12 or something, and here, this is how we are seeing the message, no orders found for the given customer ID. So that is coming from order controller exception handler only. So the idea is, if there is a exception handler in the same controller, that is going to take the highest precedence over this global exception handler in controller advice. So if you want to change the way we want to handle for specific scenarios, this is how you can use exception handler locally per controller. So we have seen how we can handle exceptions globally using controller advice, and also we have seen how we can handle exception handlers per controller, and also we have seen how we can extend this response entity exception handler to handle various Spring MVC specific exceptions, right? But as this is a common practice and this is a very common requirement in most of the applications, there is a third party library called Problem Spring Web from the company called Zalando. They have built this library called Problem Spring Web, which we can leverage to handle most of these scenarios automatically. We don't even need to write this kind of a logic to handle HTTP request method not supported, or wide variety of such all these type of exceptions. And also by default, these handlers are not including any meaningful response body. They are simply giving only HTTP status code, right? Using this problem Spring Web library, by default, it is not only giving the appropriate HTTP status code, it also includes the appropriate response body as well. So in this video, we have learned how to handle exceptions in Thymeleaf based applications and then in REST APIs. We have looked at various options like using try catch and using exception handler to handle exceptions at the controller level. And also we have looked at how we can use controller advice to handle the exceptions globally. So in the next video, we are going to learn how to use this Zalando's Problem Spring Web library to handle exceptions in REST APIs.